Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Standard H podcast, a casual conversation about the lives of entrepreneurs and those growing companies. This podcast has been a wonderful supplement to my apparel brand, Standard H, which serves up elevated casual automotive and travel-inspired apparel and accessories to you discerning car and watch lovers. It's been a blast recording these episodes, and if you like what you hear, please visit standard-h.com and sign up for our email list. Our recently revamped website not only hosts every episode of this show, but also allows you to explore the entire product assortment and our latest travel recommendations. As an email subscriber, you will then receive offers no one else is privy to, and I can promise it'll be well worth your while. Just hit pause real quick and hop over to standard-h.com to sign up. We'll be here waiting for you to hit play when you return. Watch collecting is often described as a journey, and along these roads of exploration, you may encounter independently owned brands you've never heard of creating some of the most incredible timepieces. If you're in search of these brands, look no further than Passion Fine Jewelry, owned by former Standard H podcast guest Tim Jackson. Offering incredible timepieces as well as phenomenal customer service, Passion Fine Jewelry is California's largest independent watch dealer located right here in Solana Beach, just north of San Diego. There you will find Roger Smith, Gronfeld, Kudoke, Habring, Sarpaneva, Roman Gauthier, and many more. If you can't make it to California, visit passionfinejewelry.com for their entire offering online. This episode is also brought to you by Cantonment. Cantonment's flagship product, the kerchief, is a perfect medium between a handkerchief and a bandana. Featuring iconic designs such as a Fender Stratocaster and the dashboard of a Volkswagen GTI, these utilitarian cloths are an item that should be a mainstay in your everyday carry. Tuck one in a back pocket or use one as a neckerchief. Visit them at Cantonment Co., that's CANTONMENT.co, and use the code STANDARDH in all caps, no spaces, for 20% off their entire online shop. Now let's get to the show. Adam Moore and I met several years ago during my first visit to Analog Shift when they were still in their WeWork space. I didn't realize we hadn't seen one another since until we connected for this podcast. Strange how time flies. Adam and I are of a similar age, so naturally we share a lot of the same memories of growing up as teenagers in the 90s. We both devoted a ton of time and energy to the early days of mountain biking, as well as shared an affinity for bands like Metallica. Today, Adam is a professional photographer, primarily acting as a freelancer for watch brands and companies within the watch industry. He's gained quite the following and admiration due to his incredible macro photography of some of the most sought-after timepieces many of us adore. I certainly encourage you to check out Adam's work as he often partners with the likes of Vacheron, Grand Seiko, and a couple of former brands hosted right here in Autodromo and Brew Watches. However, alongside the stills of close-up content, Adam also shoots video and gives us a wonderful explanation why. This was a fun conversation as Adam takes us down the road of how he grew his appreciation for the medium of photography and walks us through his approach to some of his more abstract horological art pieces. We wrap things up, of course, with some car talk, and Adam shared stories of his latest acquisition featuring its own Instagram account, so stay tuned for that. I'm your host, Wesley Smith, and you're listening to the Standard H podcast. Thanks so much for doing this, man.
You got it.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Adam with the T.
ATOM.
I hope this isn't a trigger. How did it come about? Are mom and dad scientists?
So I like to tell people that my parents were scientists, and they look at me with a wide-eyed like, oh really? And I'm like, and the real story is not quite as exciting. In high school when I started doing photography, I started signing my prints ATOM instead of my actual name ADAM, and it just stuck. And it kind of became like my life patch, right?
It's your stage name.
Yeah, it's my stage name. It became the thing that I was known as, but is like, I can tell people on the street like, oh yeah, my parents were scientists.
Right. So where did you grow up though?
I grew up in Massachusetts.
Okay.
I lived in New England for my formative years, and near Worcester, about 30 miles west of Boston, which is growing up in New England is actually great because a friend of mine got me into mountain biking
Sweet.
at a pretty early age.
Yeah.
Right at the beginning of high school.
What was the first bike?
The first bike was it was a Huffy. You know, it had like it wanted to be a motorcycle, it wanted to be a motocross bike, but it was, it was definitely not. And I think my parents got it for me at like Toys R Us.
Right.
It was awesome.
The R.I.P. Toys R Us.
Yeah, for sure. I used to, Toys R Us, you'd go in there and just be like walk around. You didn't have to buy anything. It was just like.
And that's exactly what I did because my mom would never let me buy anything. So I know the exact thing you're describing.
You go to the video game section and you pick up the like at the time you'd pick up the little piece of paper.
Right.
And like you just walk around and be like, and you'd have like 5 of them. You're like, which one do I want? which Nintendo game do I want?
Right. Yeah, totally.
But after the Huffy, I graduated to a GT Timberline FS, which had a RockShox Quadra 5 elastomer sprung suspension fork on the front of that thing.
Yeah, super new days of RockShox.
It was awful. It was a rock.
And that's the triangle frame.
Yep. And then from there, I eventually bought a $1,200 Trek. I think it was a 9500. I could be wrong on the number, but it was an aluminum bonded frame.
I had a 7000.
Okay.
A Trek 7000, which was aluminum.
It was an 8500.
Okay,
because it was the top of the line of the 7000.
It's a Quadra 21R fork.
So I had the first year of the Shimano XT that had the V brakes. The first year of the V brakes.
Yeah.
Which I want to say was 96.
I was gonna say 95, 96.
And it had a Manitou Mach 5 SX fork on it.
Oh, so it had the Manitou. That was like the blue and black one.
No, it was black with yellow stickers on it.
Oh, that's awesome. We'll talk more bikes later for sure.
Oh, I'm a super bike nerd, and that's probably why I got into photography so much, was because I was in mechanical things like bicycles, and I would do my own mechanical work on them.
Right.
And so then when I started doing photography in high school, it was all, of course, on film.
Right.
And here's a Pentax K1000, like, go have fun. It's all mechanical. You have to use a light meter to figure out what you're doing.
Let's talk about who Adam was in high school.
Okay.
What was coming through the speakers?
Okay, so I was definitely blasting Metallica through the speakers of my Ford Escort wagon.
Oh, rad.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So what year was the car, though? Because it wasn't new.
No, it was like 94.
I was going to say.
It was like a hand-me-down from my dad.
Yeah, but that's pretty new.
My brother and I shared it.
So you actually had a pretty new one. Like for the year.
I guess so. Well, it was like
you weren't driving like an 84.
No. And I was never really into cars when I was younger.
Right.
Although there was like a parked at the end of my street, there was a guy selling a late 70s Monte Carlo. It was like sitting in his front yard the whole time, like for sale for my entire high school days. And when I got it, and I was like, when I later in high school, when I had a job long enough, and I was like, okay, maybe I'll go buy that car because it's literally been for sale since I've ever moved into this house. No one is
buying this car.
and my dad was like, yeah, but you know what the gas mileage is on that thing? And at the time that really mattered to me because money was gas money was a thing.
Yeah. And
I was like, he's probably right. But a friend of mine actually went and looked at it one time, and the whole frame was rotted out. So it was probably a good thing I never.
Yeah.
He didn't buy it either.
Just oh my gosh.
But I loved it. I loved the shape of it. It was a little like narrower. It was wider at the front with like a narrower grille than the 80s stuff, and it was just like, for whatever reason, I loved the look of it. It was really nice. It was gray. It was like sleeper gray.
Right. I feel like so many of us, and I'm sure kids are like this today, where they're like zeroing in on a car they know is for sale, and they're just so excited about driving that they'll like think everything is cool. And like I was definitely that kid because like my brother, who's 4 years older, he had this friend Amanda, and she was selling her like ratty old Mustang. And like I'm not like a Mustang guy, but this car was for sale.
Yeah.
And I was turning 16 very soon. So I was like, Dad, like, please, can we like buy this car? It's like not that expensive. And he was basically just alluding to the fact of like, yeah, there's a good reason why it's not expensive.
Yeah.
Like, we're not buying you this car.
Yeah.
Forget about it.
It's going to explode.
Yeah.
You're not buying this car.
Yeah.
So go back to music though. So my brother and I would sit in our living room, listen to Metallica on tape, and play board games like Hero Quest. And it was awesome. My brother was super into board games. We had magic cards and we did all that kind of awesome stuff in high school.
Is he older or younger?
He's older.
Cool.
He's 16 months older, so not.
Oh, so close.
Yeah.
Cool. Did you play any instrument?
Nope.
Never.
Nope.
Never, like the recorder or anything.
Nope.
Like that?
No instruments for me.
That's interesting. But so you got into photography though.
But I got into photography and I would go and photograph bands. So like I would go to shows in Worcester and I would, at the Palladium, and I'd photograph bands there and became friends with a bunch of bands and stuff. And so I'd follow them around and hang out with them.
Any bands we'd know?
No, I don't think they're around anymore. But like, a bunch of hardcore bands and rock bands.
So what was the first camera?
So the first camera that I owned myself was one of the early EOS Canons. Yeah. But in high school, it was either a Pentax or I want to say a Canon FD mount, like, fully manual. But that was like handed to me in the class.
Okay, so you took a class in high school?
Yep. Yeah. So my parents were like, "What do you want to be when you grow up, Adam?" And I'm like, I got nothing. I don't know. And I decided to take a photography class. I think it was sophomore year. And from then on, I was like, oh, this is awesome. I love being in the dark room and focusing on this and like, printing my own stuff. And it's a really an art form. I found later in life, it became very therapeutic for me to be in the dark room. It's just like,
sure.
There's a regimented thing. You're using the chemicals. It's like you're creating the art from this piece of paper that is photosensitive and light sensitive, and it's become it's like a ritualistic what's the term like meditative thing for me.
I was just about to say it's very meditative because obviously there's process, but more importantly, like you have to focus and be in the moment.
Yeah. And, later on in life, about like 6 or 7 years ago, I figured out that I had ADHD, but only as an adult did I figure that out.
Right.
So looking back at it now in high school, that was definitely like a thing that I could hyper focus on. And it was like, oh, okay, I get it now. Like why I really enjoyed that, why it was meditative for me, because I could fully focus on it. And it was also giving me an artistic, like creative boost.
That's interesting. What led you to, I don't know, being tested for ADHD?
So it was just like I felt like was memory issues, and really it was like inattention issues. Like because I was an undiagnosed ADHD person. Like, I don't know if you know much about ADHD, but like essentially your brain can't multitask. It can't focus on two things at once. And it will automatically switch to another thing without you meaning it to. So like you and I are talking right now, but if like, we heard a refrigerator turn on or something like that, my brain would listen to that and wouldn't pay attention to what's in front of me.
Yeah.
It wouldn't zone out. It would just like, I could only focus on one thing at a time, but I don't get to choose which thing that is that I'm focusing on. So that's why, eventually I sort of like realized that and, I went to ADHD therapy, so to speak, and figured out for myself what that meant. And I'm on medication now, and it's much better. I can focus much better.
So that's interesting. You said you had memory problems, but it's because you weren't actually experiencing what you should have thought you should remember.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So where did you end up going to college? Do you have a fine arts degree?
I don't have a fine arts degree. I went to a state school in Massachusetts. I went to Fitchburg State College, which is now Fitchburg State University.
Okay.
And I went there specifically because when I was looking for colleges, I was looking at like there was a couple art schools. Obviously, Massachusetts, Boston area is known for its art schools. But I'm not an artist traditionally. Like I'm a photographer, but I'm not a painter or I don't draw.
Right.
Like, so I was like, okay, I could go to, a photography specific school in Boston, but I found this program at Fitchburg State where I didn't have to pay a crazy amount of money every year because it was a state school and I lived in state. And it was like the person who was running that program was a fine artist. And also the promise of being able to use a Hasselblad in year 2, as opposed to waiting until like mid junior year to even touch one of those, was like, oh, okay. I like this idea.
That's really interesting because I had Tim Hogan on, which if you haven't heard the episode, you should listen to it because there's some parallels here. And he's, for a while, I think he still is a Hasselblad ambassador.
Mm-hmm.
But he got to play with those level of cameras very early on.
Yeah. So I went to Fitchburg State where I was, my professor was Peter Layton, and he was a student of Minor White.
Okay.
Minor White is a contemporary of Ansel Adams. So like,
right. Black and white
photography. But the thing about going to that particular school, post graduation, I always considered Peter to be a mentor of mine because during college, he was very much like encouraging of the artistic side of things, and like our critiques were always very in depth and very, very interesting. And he didn't mind subject matters of all different kinds. It didn't matter what the subject matter was. It wasn't about that. It was about, why did you take this photo? Why did you print it this way? This could be improved. That could be improved. Or, he was always a big proponent of, you never print a negative the exact way you took it. When you're in the darkroom, you're always going to manipulate it some way, and manipulation in the darkroom is what you can do in Photoshop today, right?
Like, say it's early days of Photoshop.
Sure. Yeah. It's analog Photoshop. It's, dodging and burning is a thing that you learn to do in an artistic way. You literally cut out shapes and like hold them over the images as you're printing,
right?
And
to darken an area,
to darken or lighten an area, another area. And I really enjoyed that. It was a very positive experience for me to learn and grow my artistic photography skills in college. And then, but unfortunately, I learned very little about the business of photography there. Sure. Because Peter was very much a person who is focused on the artistic side of things.
Right.
And fortunately, when at the end of my school, I had to do an internship the last semester, and I did it here in New York City with a photographer who helped me with the business stuff. It was like he was an early proponent of digital, working with digital, and that was like in 2005.
And you were a digital tech. What the heck is that?
So a digital tech is the person who runs the computer in a photo shoot.
Right.
They're kind of like an assistant to the photographer in that, in a professional studio setting, you have the photographer and their camera, the digital camera is connected via cable, Firewire 400 in these days,
right?
Directly to the computer. And as they shoot, the images come in on the screen so you can review them. You can see if it's in focus. And you also have to catalog them because, when you're doing a job of, like, let's say, shooting for J. Crew and you have, 50 different looks in a day, you need to know the skew of that and all that. And then it's very much like a very in-depth job. And also if the camera stops working, and that time I worked with a lot of digital backs on like medium format cameras. Mm-hmm. And so you had to know how to fix that.
So, well, let me ask you this, because like, are you cataloging in real time?
So at the time that I started doing it in like 2005, 6, 7, mm-hmm. the amount of time that it took to bring a 25 megapixel file over a Firewire 400 cable into the computer, they were like 3 shots ahead of you.
Okay, that's why I was asking, because like the time sensitivity of taking said photos, right? Like if you're firing off 1,000 photos that day, or 500 photos that day.
But it was the early days of digital, so people who worked on those shoots weren't expecting things like they're expecting them today, right? Like they weren't expecting someone to shoot 200 frames for this clothing shoot for this one outfit and be able to like see it almost instantaneously. Like it was everything was a little bit slower.
Well, that's what I'm saying, because like you would need the time to catalog it, and that would then slow the process down for them otherwise.
Oh yeah.
It sounds like everything was kind of not a snail's pace, but like by today's standards, a snail's pace.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it was great because I realized that I didn't want to work in the fashion industry in New York City. Is what came out of my early days of assisting in digital teching.
Now, was that like a vibe thing, or was that like the actual product you weren't passionate about?
No, well, I mean, I suppose later on I became a little bit more passionate about style and fashion, but at the time it was more like the culture of like New York City fashion photography was just like, it wasn't my jam.
Right.
So
So you were an early, let's get into some watch talk. You were an early kind of attendee of Red Bar.
Yeah.
So tell me about those early days of meeting up with those guys. I mean, obviously James and I are friends, and you've got another Adam, right? Craniotis.
Adam Craniotis,
yeah. Like how did you get involved, and how did you discover them, or vice versa?
My wife at the time, Kathleen, we're now broken up. We have been for a couple of years now, but she used to work with Adam Craniotis in the 90s in a tech company.
Okay.
And we saw the Instagram posts he was making of like, dudes in a dark bar hunched over a table, like with these terrible photos of watches. And we're like, what the heck is that? What are you doing? And he's like, oh, you should come out. And we're like, we have swatches and like some Movados. And he's like, no, come out. Bring your swatches. It's fine.
And bring your camera.
And we're like, what? Bring the swatches? And he's like, yeah, it's fine. And we're like, aren't people going like who buy expensive watches going to be like really turned off by the fact that we have swatches? And he's like, just show up. So we did. And I think one of the first times out, we brought like 10 or 20 swatches with us. And the literally like one of the first experiences when I sat down and put the watches on the table, this woman who is a Patek dealer here in New York had a perpetual calendar with like diamonds on it, and she went, cool, I love swatches, and like took her watch off, handed it to me, and just started playing with the swatches.
Is it Kelly?
No.
Oh.
It wasn't Kelly.
I was like, I can totally see her saying that.
I don't think Kelly was in Red Bar at the time. So it was like that immediately was like, oh, these watch collector people are chill. Like it's not about having the most expensive thing or like showing up and be like, I have the biggest goldest Rolex. How are you?
Right. It's about the watches.
It's about the watches. So started going regularly, and in New York at the time and this was probably like 7 or 8 years ago now. Like they were meeting basically every week.
Wow.
So Kathleen and I really started going all the time, and she got more involved in the company aspect of it, and Adam and Kathleen and James helped make Red Bar into a company, and that the reason for that was because they needed to, because there was a bunch of chapters popping up.
Sure.
And people were like just making, Red Bar Seattle or whatever would like pop up, but we're like, wait, do you know about that, Adam? Like, who's running that? And so we had to sort of like rein it in because, it wasn't about trying to like take away the Red Bar name from people. It was more about like, let's have it all be under one umbrella and have everybody be connected. And that was great. So, but early on, I started bringing my camera, and I hadn't really photographed a lot of watches. However, I was doing some studio work, still life photography work for a company called Gilt Group, GILT.
I remember them.
I was working in the Brooklyn Navy Yards in their studio, and they were very prolific. They were pumping stuff out all the time. Right. And I had started photographing jewelry and watches for them. Mm-hmm. And I got good at jewelry, so they had me in the jewelry room a lot, photographing there, and I shot one of the early collections of watches that Gilt did with Ben Clymer
Oh, okay.
of this website called Hodinky.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is this? I don't know what this is. So I looked it up and I was like, oh. So I started following Hodinky and reading Hodinky really early on, about the same time as I started going to Red Bar. So that was like, rabbit hole.
Right.
Full on rabbit hole. And from early on at Red Bar, being sitting and I'd pick up some watches and I'd go in the corner and I'd bring my own lights and I'd like set up, and at the time I was using Dido light LED lights, just continuous lighting to photograph what I had.
Sure.
And over the time I started developing my process and I started using flash and I started bringing that in. So I'm the guy sitting over in the corner of the bar with little flashes going off. And fortunately the place we were meeting was like, downstairs at a bar in Koreatown, and it was like nobody cared. But
right.
It's from there I met James Lambden from Analog Shift, and that was when he had just, I think the company had been around maybe a year or so.
Got it.
I'm not really sure actually, but it was early on in his company, and his partner, Jake, was going on vacation, and he's like, hey, I need somebody to come in for like a month and fill in. And he had met me at Red Bar and seen what I could do. And I did, and I was there for 4 years. And from there, by the time I was done at Analog Shift, I was like I basically was only photographing watches for as a business.
Nice. So how did that sort of role evolve for you there? Like, it was almost kind of like off the cuff, right? Like, come in, I need some help.
Yeah.
So like, what were you doing differently in year 4 that you weren't doing in day 1? Like, how was the role? Did the role change much?
It did. Like, it was just, me as a hired gun photographer for a minute, until, we realized that like, oh, I had ideas on how we could streamline the process, because at the time there was very few people selling vintage watches online.
Mm-hmm.
So it was like, how do we build this into a thing that's a little bit better? And for me, because I had come from a background of being a digital tech and working with, professional photo shoots, I was like, okay, we need to streamline this in a way that like all of the images, all the watches need to look the same way on the front page, on the page of watches, and like they need to be in the same angle, and they, everything needs to have a consistency, a look to it.
Sure.
And, it just sort of, James's business really picked up.
Yeah.
And it was really successful at the time, and was like, so by year 4, we had moved to our own space and out of the WeWork, and we were like doing collaborations with a bunch of different people as far as like, different watch stores around the country. We were doing like pop-ups basically of vintage watches in there, and different kinds of photography. And from photographing all of the different, so let's take Speedmasters, for instance.
Sure.
Over the course of 4 years, I probably photographed, I don't know, like
Hundreds.
dozens of Speedmasters.
Right.
And I would look at all of these Speedmasters back to back, and I could see all the different variations of them. And that's when I started doing the artistic stuff with the mashup art that I was doing. Like, I started doing in like 2015.
Right.
Which was around the end of when I was working with James. I started doing that stuff based on seeing all the vintage models that were like the same version of the same watch, but they had different patina, they had different look to them.
Sure.
And because I was so, ADHD focused on the details of all that stuff, it was like, oh, cool. Look at this one's a dot over 90 bezel, and this one, look at the hand shape on this one versus the one that was supposedly made the year before. Like,
right. So you were finding the things that made them distinct,
mm-hmm.
right, and
Mm-hmm.
noticeably different.
And like, this one has a tropical dial. That's super cool. Or like, somebody would show up and it's like, this one's not for sale, but like they'd have some, a 29151, like a super early first version Speedmaster. It's like, that stuff is special, and knowing the stories behind all the watches, and people would come in and like, consign their collections with James, and it would be like, what's the story behind this watch?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that's where like, okay, there's history behind each individual watch from its owner, but also the history of the brand and the story and why the watch was made.
Those are the meat hooks, man.
Yeah.
That's what gets you into it.
It's like there's so many angles and variations.
Yeah.
And then looking at the close-up details with my lens was really where I was like, oh, watches are awesome.
Yeah.
Like mechanical stuff is super cool. And like, knowing my background of mechanical bicycles and mechanical cameras, it's an easy leap to go to mechanical watches.
Yeah, for sure. Can you describe the pieces you shot that sort of got the attention of, the likes of Tudor, for example?
Yeah. So I photographed a bunch of, one of the art pieces, the mashups I made was of Tudor Submariner bezels. A lot of them were faded bezels, which of course, even today is like super sought after to have like a faded bezel and like a specific color.
Mm-hmm.
And Tudor has the very specific snowflake hand,
right?
And everybody loves that. So I did a variation on the this sort of abstract piece with the snowflake hand and the bezels intertwining, and there was no dials or other hands on there at all. It doesn't look like a watch.
Right.
It almost looks like a snowflake in a way.
Right.
And so I had made several of those images and I posted them on Instagram, and people were in the early heydays of Instagram when you could actually gain followers by posting things. And I went to a watch convention in London. I went to Salon QP with Red Bar, and we were walking between appointments or whatever, and there was this guy stopped me in the hallway, and he's like, "Hey, I work for Tudor, and I wanted to talk to you about something. Do you have time to talk to me?" And for a minute, I was like, sort of panicking, because I was like,
what did I do wrong?
What did I do wrong that Tudor and Rolex have taken notice of me, right? And turned out that he was like, "Oh, I want to commission you to do a collection of your art specifically for Tudor." And I think it was like the second year the Black Bay was out.
Okay, so 2014.
Yep. And it was 2015.
Okay.
I think it was the winter of 2015 or maybe it was 2016. In any case, he was like, we struck a deal, and I went to Geneva to the Tudor headquarters, the Rolex headquarters.
Unbelievable.
And it was right before Basel World. So the watches hadn't been released, and they couldn't like even go down the street to a studio. They had to do it there.
Right.
And so I went to like sub basement number 5, which was according to him the lowest level that like any non-Tudor employee had ever been to in the building.
I was gonna say, I've seen a YouTube video of like their vault or whatever, and it's incredible looking.
Yeah. So like I was in some windowless room in the basement, and like in sub basement number 5, and I had these watches. They're just like, "Cool, have fun," and like gave me the watches and like let me go at it for a day or two. And it was from there we did I made a full collection of, I think I probably made like 10 different mashups.
And it ended up in
so we did
Hong Kong, right?
Yeah, we did a sort of a one-off show of it in Hong Kong, and they chose the location, and it was fantastic. They made the prints there, and they hung them up, and it was like that was sort of like the kickoff of like my artistic career. Now before that, I had a show here in New York at a gallery called Sacred Gallery inside of a tattoo shop down by Canal Street.
Cool.
A friend of mine was running the gallery there, and I had my first watch photography show there. But from then on, and that show, that original show was half mashups and half just sort of macro shots.
Cool.
But from there, from the Tudor thing, it was like, oh, okay, I want to do
that thing.
If I'm going to show something in the gallery, it's going to be, it's going to be the sort of mashup, brain dump of like unique looking stuff that's not actually just a photo of a watch.
Sure. What size are the prints?
So the prints I was making were anywhere between 30 inches, 36 inches, or 48 inches. I did end up making some.
So these are like legit posters.
Yeah, and usually they're square and they're printed on metal.
Okay.
So they're printed on aluminum with a dye sublimation process where, because they're on metal, my printer, which is here in Brooklyn, does a technique where they don't print the highlights and they let the aluminum come through. So if something
cool.
is
White, it'll be
fully white,
silver.
It's really sort of like a silvery tone.
Yeah.
But for watches, it makes total sense because if you have a highlight on a case, it's like the silver watch case coming through. So it's kind of neat.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
What's a quick rundown of your gear bag today?
Gear bag today. So I really like. So for instance, I'm about to go to Watches and Wonders, and do the show that has been postponed and used to be SIHH, but Red Bar used to go to all of the conventions for the last several years, and I would go as the photographer.
Sure.
This year, I'm going with Hodinky as a freelancer.
Nice.
And I've honed my gear really quickly. It's a small camera suitcase, and I have a Leica CL. I have some little tiny flashes by a little Chinese company, Light Pix Labs, and I have like 5 of those. And it has a tiny little transmitter that goes on top of the camera, so I can put the flashes anywhere I need to.
Are you using 5 flashes at once?
No, not usually.
Okay.
I have that many.
You just have that many, right?
I usually use 2, maybe 3. But then I have a collection of white and black cards.
For either bouncing
for bouncing. So
yeah.
And I'll make a little book out of them. So I've got a little collection of cards, and several batteries, several flashes, and a camera, and I'll have a backup camera just in case. But
So you're like a CL guy.
I've been using the Leica CL at the conventions because it's light.
Mm-hmm.
It's an APS-C sensor, so it's I think it's 21 or 24 megapixels, which is plenty.
Sure.
And it has a dedicated 1:1 macro lens, which is the reason I wanted that camera. Now it's the same mount as the new SL and SL2 and those cameras,
Right.
which is now shared across several different platforms from different companies.
Yep. Are you using the Summicron or Summilux?
Well, it's actually it's neither, because the macro lens is a
Its own thing.
2.8.
Okay.
So I guess it would be an Elmerit, I think is what they would call it.
Okay.
So Summicron denotes f2, and Summilux denotes f1, 1.4.
Right.
In Leica speak.
Yeah.
So I do have a 35 1.4 Summilux for that system also.
Yep.
But because it's APS-C, it's actually more like a 50 millimeter lens. Don't you love all the
Right.
numbers and
the
math that you have to do in your own head?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I love that camera because it's tiny and light. And like for a minute, I was bringing my Canon DSLR to the shows, and it was just like, my wrists hurt. Why do my wrists? Oh.
Well, the random question on the business side. Like, you've worked alongside big and small brands.
Mm-hmm.
How much biz development, like biz dev stuff, are you doing these days versus, just fielding phone calls? Because you're kind of the macro guy, obviously,
yeah.
right? So
I do a fair amount of biz dev. It depends. Like, I've got a couple of different sides. I've got my artistic side where I do art things, and sometimes I do collaborations with brands specifically on the art side of things. I just did something with Grand Seiko. And other times I'll do, sort of what I might call straight photography, as far as like, it's not art, it's not mashup art, but it's just simple photography of watches.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've worked with Vacheron fairly recently on a couple of things.
What'd you shoot for Vacheron?
So Vacheron and I have a sort of an ongoing thing that started right before the pandemic. I photographed a bunch of their watches and then made large metal prints of them, and we were doing boutique events.
cool.
So I did a Miami boutique event and an LA event. And then that was, I think it was in 2019. And then things, of course, took a turn. And then again, last year we did another LA event.
On Rodeo?
Yep.
Okay.
And
that's a great crew there.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
So the watchmaker there is actually a Red Bar guy.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
I've just only met Kyung.
Okay.
And she's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So for you Vacheron fans, visit Rodeo and go see Kyung.
So, early on when I started going to Red Bar, I didn't get what Vacheron was doing. I was just like, wait, why is that time-only watch $30,000? I just don't understand.
Right.
But when you look at it from a perspective not of like, oh my God, that's a really expensive watch. If you look at it
that's an incredible watchmaking process.
This brand has a history.
Yeah.
And so there's something there. But then also the level of respect that the watchmakers are giving the world of creating timepieces is, they are artisans. They're true artisans. And, of course, that $30,000 watch is a platinum case.
Sure.
And, those little details that you don't think about
right.
when you're just looking at the price.
Right.
So they also, they have heritage lines that have obviously now become much more, there's the whole, integrated bracelet thing is like a world unto its own. But, so I worked with Vacheron recently, but I also work with people like Bradley at Autodromo.
Yeah, exactly.
And, I don't want to pigeonhole myself as like only a macro photographer for people like Vacheron. Or Grand Seiko. I want to be able to work with everybody because I actually respect and like brands like Autodromo and Brew watches.
Right.
Both those brands are here in the New York area, but like those people are great. And from going to Red Bar, you meet these people and you're like, wow, you're a person I want to hang out with.
Right. Exactly.
And then you're like, oh, you have a watch brand too. Okay, cool. Like, and going to a Worn and Wound's wind up watch fairs, the early ones, and you meet these people who are extremely passionate about what they do. And just because they aren't a big watch brand but they're doing their own design. Bradley and John from Brew Watches, they're incredible designers of watches. They may not be a watchmaker. They may not be physically creating the product with their own hands.
But their vision is just coming from a different place.
But their vision is being transcribed by other people to be what they want it to be. So
that's kind of how I run Standard H, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm not sewing shirts. You
Sure.
know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah, so I completely identify with that.
Yeah.
And they couldn't be nicer people.
Exactly.
Both of them.
Yeah.
John's episode is actually launching Tuesday.
Oh, right on.
So
Cool. Look forward to it.
He's picking me up tomorrow in his Aston and we're going to go for a drive. So yeah, incredible guy.
Yeah. You join the Aston Club. Yep.
Yeah. Well, you also shoot video from time to time.
I do. Yeah. So a few years ago it was like, okay, every photographer needs to become a videographer.
Yeah.
And
is that because the camera's capability can achieve it?
No, it's because it's what people are asking for.
Okay.
And it's definitely like a few years ago, 5 years ago, it was like, oh, this is definitely the way that people are going to start asking for commercially.
Is that social media driven? Is it website driven? Is it email blast driven? Is it all encompassing?
I think it's all encompassing, but it's definitely a social media thing. Like,
sure.
You want to see the watch, but also I understand as a watch collector myself that like seeing a still photo of a watch can give you an idea of what it is, but seeing, for instance, a Grand Seiko like I have here today, when you see it move, you understand a lot more than you do from seeing the still photo.
Sure.
But it's very difficult in a video to make the watch look like your still photo as far as the reflections and that kind of thing.
Right.
So being a macro photographer, I've taught myself now how to be a video editor, and I've listened to several podcasts lately about photography and video stuff, and it's like it's much more difficult to teach yourself a video editing program than it is to be a Photoshop proficient in Photoshop.
Yeah, I've always wanted to video these conversations,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm like, I edit them. If I introduce video, that's one more editing thing I need to learn.
Certainly.
And it seems like a daunting task,
Yeah.
frankly. It's interesting. You were talking about like things appearing different in person versus in photos.
Mm-hmm.
I was at A Long Insona yesterday,
Uh-huh.
and we were discussing how there's a lot of times you'll see a watch in person and you're like, wow, this is so much better than it is in the photos. But then there are other brands that you look at the photos and you're like, wow, these photos are incredible. And I was actually like let down in person. If an ALS is better in person than it is in photos, like what do you think you need to achieve in a photo to not make that happen so it's more on a level playing field?
What kind of photos are you talking about? Are you talking about like people posting
Website
photos of it?
photos.
Website photos. Okay.
Yeah.
So some of the brands want their watches to look a certain way in their website photos. That is almost what seems like impossible. I'm not saying Longa's doing this necessarily. But
No, this is not to call out Longa,
but
because that's like an incredible brand.
Sure. But in general, some brands, and I don't know who this is at the brands who are leading this, but
right,
the watches almost look like renders.
I see.
Now, oftentimes before a watch is launched, they will do renders, and a lot of video stuff is actually renders of the watch. A lot of the flyovers that you see where the watch like comes apart and like perspective. That's all.
It has to be digital.
It has to be digital.
Yeah.
But the renders are so good now that you can almost use a render as a photo of a watch.
So do you think this is by design?
But I think that the lighting and the retouching that some of the brands do makes the watch look, it's sitting in a black void on their website and you have no idea how big it is or what the light is going to look like when it reflects off of it.
Fair.
And I can understand why you would want your watch to look 100% perfect in the way that the brand's mind's eye sees it. I get that.
Mm-hmm.
But as a collector, as somebody who sees what people are asking for when you go to a watch event, they're like, I really don't know, have any idea what that watch actually looks like or what it is. So in my photography, I sort of tried to go in a direction of lighting watches, even in my studio photography of like, on white backgrounds or black backgrounds, of watches that, so you can understand a little bit more of what it actually is.
Sure.
Some brands really like that, and some brands are think that's, it's too rough of a look.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, since you're so close to those details,
Mm-hmm.
both literally and figuratively, I guess, who are some of the call outs, like the favorites, and like, what are you loving these days, especially as of late?
One of the things that one of the brands I'm close to that I've seen a lot of their stuff recently is or the innovations that they're doing is Moritz Grossmann.
Okay.
And Glashütte.
Yep.
They have this bumper wind automatic, so to speak. I'm sure that's simplifying it, but they have this automatic movement called the hammatic that essentially is a bumper wind. It's like it doesn't have a rotor that goes all the way around. It has an oscillating weight that goes back and forth.
So the ham is like a hammer? Is that kind of?
I believe that's the designation for it. Yeah. And it's much more elegant and well designed than the early bumper wind automatic movements that were in like JLCs or whatever. But
right.
It seeing that kind of innovation, they could have easily just done an automatic movement with a rotor or peripheral rotor or whatever.
Right.
But I like that. The innovation in that brand is something that I don't think it's talked about enough. They've done a lot of really interesting stuff. Just minute little tiny things in the movements that you don't really think about or see, but I think they're almost like they're a very German brand, and they don't necessarily yell from the rooftops the way that they probably could. I don't know if that's a German thing or not, but
okay.
Another one that I really got into lately is Grand Seiko. I've really become I did just do some work with them, but even before that, I was really drawn to their watches in the sense that they are very whimsical about their design, and they're very purposeful about that. So not only do they create extremely beautiful made watches, they got the Zaratsu clear, like polishing that's like a mirror finish,
Right.
but the playfulness with like their seasons watches, for instance,
the color,
the colors, the textures. But it's not just that they have a beautiful watch that has colors and textures on it. It's that they back it every single detail up with, we designed this watch with this color on the dial because of this particular part of spring that, the light bounces off of, the mountains this way or whatever, in some part of Japan, that they're very much Japan centric.
right.
And in a way that's, whimsical and poetic. And that grabs me a lot.
You have a green one sitting on the table here.
Yes.
What drew you to the green?
This is one of the recent manual wind limited editions that they did last year, and they came out with 3 different variations of a green color, which is, everyone was doing a green watch last year. It's a little bit of a, it was the trend.
Yeah, I was gonna say you'll never forget 2020 or 2021. That era, the green era, right?
When everyone was like, "Are you doing green? Yes, we're doing green. You're doing green? Yep. Okay, we're gonna all do green together. Ready, guys? We're doing green."
Now it's Tiffany blue.
And this almost has like some like Tiffany bluish tones to it.
Yeah,
it's
and
more of
certain
like
light. Yeah.
It's more of a tealy kind of green.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really the texture on the dial. It's like extraordinarily subtle texture.
Yeah.
I have one more call out of a brand. There's an LA based brand called Joshua Shapiro, JN Shapiro watches, and I've been fortunate enough to do some work with him recently.
His engine turn
Stuff is really tremendous.
It's remarkable, like,
and
in the truest sense of the word.
One of the things I see, especially with engine turn dials, is that when you take super macro shots of it, you'll see these like little imperfections in the way that the metal is scraped by the machine that's making the pattern, and I actually really like that.
Yeah.
Not to say that it's imperfect in a way that, like, to the human eye you cannot see these small marks or whatever.
But from a macro level, it's like macro wabi sabi.
Macro wabi sabi, yeah. And
Yeah.
and like, I feel like he is doing something really interesting as far as traditional watch technique, but he's a young guy, and he's sort of a newcomer to the watch world, and I appreciate that he's doing these older techniques, but with a modern young person eye. I mean, young person, he's probably our age, but like,
Right, sure.
And generally speaking, a lot of the well-known watchmaker names are, generally speaking,
Our parents' age.
Exactly.
Or older.
So seeing his watches evolve over the last couple of years has been really interesting, and he's also a very fine person.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to know him. It's also he's also working on making a U.S. made movement.
Cool.
And I know he's sort of talked about this a little bit, and I hope, Joshua, I'm talking to you. Will you let me photograph that movement, please, when it's ready?
It's funny. I've been in touch with him about getting him on the show, and I just need to circle back and get him on, frankly, because I'm in LA all the time and would love to check him out and bring him on the show for sure, because I'm dying to talk to him. I love his work. It's incredible. You mentioned textured dials. Do you have any sort of preference whatsoever as to the types of watches that are the most fun to shoot, be it a textured dial versus, say, like a perpetual calendar chronograph or something that's like super complex?
I've seen so many watches of all shapes and sizes and colors and styles and complications. This remains true that every watch that gets in front of my camera is my current favorite watch.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure each kind of bring their own thing.
They do. And it's like, it could just be a time only piece, and it could be extraordinarily simple. They could be trying to do nothing with it other than it being a watch that tells time, and I can find something interesting with it. You know, it's like, for me, that's part of it is really like looking at each piece as what's cool about this, what can I photograph about this, whether even if it's just an angle of the lug underneath that looks interesting. It was thought out. It was, you know, it's architectural design almost. It's architectural design, it's mechanical design, it's
ergonomic design.
It's heritage design. You know, there's so many different aspects to it. So it's like, do I have a favorite? No.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's completely fair. It's probably an unfair question. What was your first car?
My first car was a dark blue Ford Escort wagon that was handed down from my dad.
Got it. That was the first one. Yeah.
And my brother and I shared that. It was actually, I think it was probably his car first, and then
I see.
I took it over. But I loved it because it was a wagon, and I had gotten into mountain biking when I was young. So it was like, I could literally just put the seats down in the back and shove my bike in there, and I'm ready to go.
I still do that.
But I've tried to continue the trend of having vehicles that have less than 90 horsepower. My current car that I just bought during the pandemic as my project is a 1985 Volkswagen Vanagon Westfalia.
Toxie
the Avenger. And if you don't get the reference of Toxie, it's the Toxic Avenger, which actually they're remaking that movie.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. It's like in the near future. I think it's being made now.
So it's green.
It's dark green. Yep, it's sort of like an army green.
Did you paint it or?
Nope. Okay, I got it that way.
Got it.
Somebody had it repainted. It was originally brown, which is a color that they made.
Yeah, very popular for those, especially that era.
Yeah. You know, everyone wants a poop brown.
Right.
You know, actually, it was sort of like a dark. It was like a burnt loaf of bread brown.
That's a really good descriptor. What?
Well, the vehicle is like a loaf of bread.
Do you want to shout out the Instagram handle for the van?
Sure. It's Toxie the Avenger.
Okay, so that's pretty
Toxie
cut and dry.
Yep. I don't post a whole lot on there, but it's you know, the whole hashtag van life thing is just it's like, it makes me cringe a little bit. So I had to have a little bit of fun with naming the van.
So what drew you to the Vanagon to begin with?
You know, a few years back, I took a trip with my now partner Bria and we went to Cape Cod, and I rented a 70s bus.
Cool.
And drove from Rhode Island to the tip of the Cape and back. And because that vehicle only had like 60 horsepower, you can't go fast. You can't go on the highway.
Right.
So you're forced to go on the side roads and see everything that's around you. And so, you know, the whole trip was like, what's over there? Let's go check it out.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, you could sleep in the van, and like, you know, it's a house on wheels, but it's tiny. It's small. It's like, it's no bigger than a pickup truck. So it's like, you can park in the parking lot. You can go on, you know, you don't have to worry about driving in a city with tight corners. So after driving that vehicle, I was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. And I could see myself owning something like this one day.
Yeah.
But of course the early buses, the 70s buses, have they're a bit much of a learning curve of how to work on a car. Mm-hmm. And they definitely need to be worked on a lot. So I took the creature comforts of having a water-cooled engine and, you know, working heater.
Yeah.
And power steering.
Creature comforts, yeah.
Of the 1985 Vanagons. And so in a couple of years back, I started searching for one, and eventually it was during the pandemic, and it was difficult to find one locally that I could actually look at, and most of them are out in California or Oregon or somewhere, you know, on the West Coast.
Sure.
And Colorado, but it's like, at the time it was like $2,000 to transport it across the country.
That's the cost of a new engine.
And so I was like, okay, maybe I'll look locally. And I eventually found this one in Brooklyn that had been transported here from California about 4 or 5 years ago, and it hadn't been driven much since then. And the guy loved it, but it was like he couldn't park it anymore because he lived in a spot of Brooklyn that he couldn't do that.
Right.
And it definitely needed some work when I first got it. This guy wasn't mechanical at all. And so I bought it and I had a little work done on it, and just to make it drivable. But there's such a big community, like the watch community. There's such a big community around the Vanagons and the buses and all VW stuff. But like,
Totally.
there's a website called the Samba that is essentially like the watch forums for Vanagons, right? Like,
Right.
if you could be broken down on the side of the road and you could make a post on there that says, "Help, this is my symptoms," and they would literally, like, people would post in the middle of the night and like tell you what's wrong with your van.
Momentarily.
Yeah. But there's such an aftermarket community, just like, there's aftermarket straps for basically every watch. It's like there's all these companies that are now still, 35 years after my van was made, making parts, making upgrades, making things that are cool
Right.
for the van. So I can make it my own, and I can like modify it and tinker with it and play with it.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I've also had to become my own mechanic.
Right. Right.
Because
Right.
it's a 1.9 liter gas engine that maybe had 82 horsepower when it was brand new in 1985, maybe,
Right.
when it was new.
Yeah.
Does it still have that? But it still has the original size engine for that van, and it's like it's going strong.
Right. Oh, that's awesome. Well, I know you've added like a couple racks and the box on the back and stuff. We'll have to post some photos and, like you said, the Instagram handles so people could check it out. But have you had to make any like suspension changes or anything like that as you add weight to the back like that? Like,
so there's a company out in California called Go Westy that makes a lot of like extra spring kits and things like that for the van. So when I got it, it was slightly raised from its original height.
I see.
So somebody had already done a couple of like
Mods
to it that were stuff I would have done myself. But for me, like my partner and I ride a tandem.
Cool.
And we can, like, I've got a rack and I can literally stick it on the back of on the van, so I can actually get it off, because putting the van itself is 7 feet tall.
Right.
So imagine putting a 45-pound tandem onto the top of a 7-foot tall thing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But like when I was a kid, I had a station wagon and I could throw everything in the back. So this thing is awesome because it's almost like a reverse station wagon because the engine is in the rear.
Right.
And now there are like 4-wheel drive models, and everyone's always asks me. There's 2 questions they ask me: do you live in that thing?
Right.
And is it 4-wheel drive?
Right.
And it's like the 4-wheel drive versions are awesome, but they need so much more work and they cost a lot more.
Yeah,
so.
I was going to say they're significantly more expensive for sure. Well, do you have any particular trips planned up and coming?
Let's see. I'm going to the Montreal F1 race.
Oh, sweet.
In June.
I went in 2011.
And I've never been to an F1 race. And my partner is a huge Red Bull fan. So
it's good timing.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Last year was fun. And so I was like, let's go to an F1 race. And Miami would have been cool to go to, but we're so much closer. We can drive to Montreal.
And Montreal is so much cooler of a city.
I've never been, actually, so it's going to be awesome.
It's amazing. I love it. And the track is interesting. It's kind of off on an island, I believe.
It is. It's on an island.
We took the subway there, and it was unbelievable. Actually, when I went, I started in New York City. We took the train out of, I think, Penn Station. And we went all the way to Montreal.
Well, it's essentially due north.
Yeah, and it was incredible. Longest race ever recorded on record.
Oh, interesting.
It rained the entire time. I have a whole other story about that, but where I think it was Vettel passed Jensen Button or vice versa in the last corner on the last lap, and we left early because it was raining. It was raining. I mean, that's why it's
What
the
are you?
longest.
What are you, a Dodger fan? Like
Well,
leaving in the 7th inning?
no. It was one of those things where like we thought it was going to finish under caution. It had been under caution for laps and laps and
Sure.
laps. So we're like, okay, well, this is the results are before us. They're just going around at 60 miles an hour instead of 180. So we're just kind of like, or 90 miles an hour or whatever. And so we left and we got to the bar and they were like, oh my God, did you see the last lap? And we're like, you're kidding me. So as mortified as I am telling this story now, I wouldn't have this story to tell. I watched it really.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they passed in the corner we were standing in all day, which is just insult to injury at this point. But anyway,
Awesome.
You'll love Montreal. Incredible track. I love that race. So before watches though, you were collecting bike parts?
So, you know how in the watch world there's the independent brands?
Of course.
Like, you've got your Sarpanevas and your Kai Voutilainens and, your Debatuns.
Yep.
For me, in high school, I started doing some bicycle racing and I was never any good at it. And I never graduated beyond the beginner class. But
right.
I began to covet these super highly precisionally made aluminum billet parts that a lot of which were made in the USA at the time in California.
Mm-hmm.
And like that started my, collecting mentality. So all these bikes that I saw when I was a kid that I couldn't afford, when I moved to New York City as an adult, I would troll Craigslist and I would buy all these bikes that were I bought a Voodoo Bazango with XTR and a Judy SL from 1996 that this guy had brought here from wherever he moved from and couldn't store anymore and was like $300. Take it. I can't fit it in my apartment.
Right. Get it out of here.
So I bought all sorts of like high-end Bontragers and stuff like that from all these 90s bikes that I was like from these small builders before they got eaten up by larger corporations. And I was like, it's like a treasure trove. I can go out and find all these super awesome bikes. And so I started buying them. I'd buy them, I'd fix them up, I'd ride them, and then I'd flip them to a friend who could, for what I paid for it.
Yeah.
Just because it was fun to be able to ride all this cool stuff.
Yeah, sure.
And over the years, I ended up with a large collection of bike stuff. Paul components from California. I've got a lot of their hubs and cranks and brake levers.
Yeah.
And I've got some pretty high end stuff that's like fairly collectible now. And actually, I'm about to sell off a few of my high end pieces from I've got an Ibis titanium Mojo. So that's where my titanium love started was bikes.
Wow.
I love titanium watches, and the reason I do is because titanium as a material for bikes has always been like the top notch thing for me. It's been my most coveted thing because it's like when I was a kid, owning a titanium bike was like it was aspirational at best. It was like untouchable.
Did you get into moots at all?
Oh yeah, I've never owned a moots, but I have a lot of I have a few of their bars and several of their stems.
Have you checked out Stinner? I had Aaron on the show.
Okay,
he's a lovely guy.
I'll have to.
And as fate would have it, I just met his brother at a wedding in Phoenix 3 weeks ago. Had no idea they were related. Obviously, just
cool.
Small world type of thing.
A few years back, I started going to the North American handmade bike shows, which they have in a different city every year. And there is just it's a convention of all the tiny builders that you can just go in and, talk to Ted Wojcik and you can, meet Belinky. And do you know Belinky?
No.
So Belinky is a builder down in Philadelphia.
Okay.
And I have one of their tandems. My partner Bria and I ride a Belinky tandem that we bought during the pandemic. Now, tandem bikes are an interesting thing, and I've really gotten into them lately. And actually, the reason I'm selling off some of my vintage kit is because I'm after a mountain bike tandem.
Oh, cool.
Right now, we've got a road tandem, which has S&S couplers. Do you know what those are?
I don't.
So there's.
My brother-in-law builds tandems.
Oh, really?
For he and his wife, he's built them.
Oh, cool.
But I know nothing about tandem
Okay.
bikes.
So
aside from my brother-in-law builds them,
so
and 2 people ride them.
Quick high-level tandem thing. There's 2 people. You're connected via chains, and you literally have to pedal at the same time.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So the captain is on the front, the stoker's on the back, and usually the person in the back is doing a little bit more of the heavy pedaling because they don't have to focus on steering. But you have to pedal together, and the person behind you can't see what's going on, so you have to shout commands at them to, when you want to stop pedaling, for instance, because if I stop pedaling and the stoker doesn't, then the cranks still move forward.
Right.
So you have to, it's a communication thing.
Sure.
So we have a road tandem from Belinky, and it's got S&S couplers, which means that it has the frame is broken in certain spots and has these couplers that you can unscrew with a special tool, and you can break it down. The reason you can do that is so you can put it in 2 bike boxes.
So my brother-in-law built his bike like this, I guess, because he travels with it.
Yep. So it's a travel thing. And so normally, in times past when people would travel with their bicycles and it wasn't a pandemic, if you had a bike box, which is huge, an airline would charge you $350 to bring your bike with you. But if you could break it down into a small box, it wouldn't be a large size thing, and you could just check it with.
It's a suitcase for $30. Yeah.
So the tandem breaks down into 2 boxes, and that way you can travel to wherever with it.
That's
and
great.
Just like with vintage watches that have stories, this particular Belinky that we have has, we know that it's been to New Zealand with a previous owner, the guy who originally built it, who's not who I bought it from, but like, we know that the bike has been around the world, right? So it's like,
that's cool.
It's one of those cool stories. It's like, it's made from steel. It's handmade by somebody who, is a stone's throw away from us now, who I can still talk to. Still, I've contacted him about the bike, but now I'm after a mountain bike tandem, which is a whole nother scenario.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, dude, just wrapping up here, the beard is legendary.
Thank you.
What is the maintenance like?
So have you ever had a beard?
No.
Okay. So imagine this. You have a thing over your front lip, over your top lip, that when you eat soup or anything like that, that it's too long when the food mainly gets stuck in the mustache. And
right.
Not doesn't go into your mouth.
Fair. Yeah.
So that's when I know that it's time to trim the mustache. And that's about the majority of the maintenance that I do. So
it's the soup test.
The soup test, yeah. But a lot of people put products in their beard. I generally don't.
Right.
I wash it like hair because I don't know if you know this, but it's hair.
Right. Oh my God, that's awesome. Adam, this was super fun.
Yeah,
man.
Thanks.
Well, just so other people know, like, where can they find you? Like, buy your prints, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I've got a website, AdamMoore.com, ATOMMOORE. Moore is how you spell that. Yeah, I sell prints on there, but also you can see a lot of my photography on there. Also, my handle on Instagram is at Adam Moore. Also, I have a fun thing happening this year. I'm doing a collaboration with an a yet to be named independent watch brand.
Okay.
Where I've designed a dial, and they're making a watch. And
I think I read that recently.
And it's going to be available at some point.
What is any detail you can give us?
The case is going to be stainless steel.
All right. Okay.
And that might be a big deal.
All right, man. Well, let's chat soon.
I like it.
Okay. Hey guys, Wesley here. If you liked what you heard, maybe tell a friend about the Standard H podcast. And if you have a moment, please rate and review the show, as it helps others discover this podcast. Shout out to Jensen Reed and Super Beautiful for the theme track, as well as the clear audio for the noise canceling headphones. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.